Okay, go ahead. You're on.
I'm on?
Yep.
Okay, welcome everybody to the socially distanced State of the Bay briefing. I am, as always, the chair, Kumar Barve. I'm joined by the vice chair, Dana Stein, our ranking Republican member, Delegate Jacobs. And I anticipate that most of the committee will join us shortly. So without any further ado, let's get to it. Allison, why don't you begin, since you're first on the agenda?
Share my screen and cross my fingers.
There you go. We can hear you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can see the slides. I know that Kristen Flynn also has them if there's any problems with it. I have told the e-learners in the house that Mom has a presentation, so hopefully they will not join in the presentation, but we shall see. So I'm Allison Prost. I am now the Vice President of Environmental Protection and Restoration with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I took a promotion this summer, so this will be one of my last State of the Bay presentations in front of this committee. I think this marks number 13 for me doing this. We will soon be hiring a new Maryland Executive Director. I am joined this morning by Robin Clark. She will be the face of CBF. She joined us last year around this time. She will be the face of CBF in the virtual halls of session this year. She is our point on legislative matters. You can find our contact information at the end of the session or at the end of this presentation if you don't already have it. I'm going to go through some slides. I'm not sure, Chairman, if you want questions at the end of my presentation or if you want the Chesapeake Bay Commission to go and then answer questions. I am comfortable with whatever you decide.
Yeah, we'll do questions after both presentations.
Okay. This is just a little snapshot of Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I know many of you are familiar with our advocacy work because you're used to seeing us in the committee room or reading our testimony. But I just wanted to portray some of the oyster restoration work that we do, the number of trees that we've planted, students and teachers that have come out on field trips, the amount of produce that we share with the community from our farm in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, trash that's been picked up. All of this connects. What we hear from our members, what we see on the ground influences the policies that we promote. And what you're hearing from your constituents is often what we're hearing from our members as well. So, you know, the multi-pronged approach has served CBF very well, and we see it continuing on into the future. Each year we show you the state of the blueprint. And since this is something you've seen before, we recently produced a new video during our online education that had to replace field trips. And I think it gives a very good snapshot of the Clean Water Blueprint and our approach to cleaning up the bay. I practiced this yesterday, so hopefully this is going to work.
I'm having difficulty hearing it. I don't know about anyone else.
I can't hear a thing.
I can't either.
Okay. Well, maybe I will skip it and send
Yeah,
it.
we hear that.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I could hear you.
Okay. Well, then I will send the link to this so that you can go on and see it. It was done by members of our education. So now I'm going to skip ahead to this. going to skip the slide. Sorry, this is just going to take me a minute to advance to the next slide.
No worries.
So anyway, I will send the link around so that you can see it. It was done with our educators and just visual representation of the Clean Water Blueprint, because it can kind of be a wonky concept. The idea is, as you've heard before, that it is the total maximum daily load, the limits that we need to get to, and it is the cooperative plans between the states and the federal government to reach those goals. Each year, we check in to see how we're doing on the Clean Water Blueprint. We released a report this summer, the 2020 look into the blueprint. I attached a copy of it, so you should have it with your materials from this presentation. Normally, we would send you hard copies, but there is a PDF attached to the materials today. You know, the short answer is the blueprint's a success. We are seeing positive improvements throughout the watershed, even with the population growth that has taken place since 2010 when the blueprint first was put in place. What we do is we look at the loads that EPA assigned to each state, the reductions that they need to make. We look at the plans that the states have put in place, and will that trajectory get them to the 2025 reductions or not? We then take a closer look to see if the loads that states have set for themselves for each sector, whether or not they're on point. And finally, the third thing that the report looks at is the specific commitments to different best management practices or policy agendas that each state set for themselves. All three of these give us an indication of whether or not we will meet our shared 2025 goals or not. And you have seen this before, but this is this year's snapshot. So watershed-wide, how are we doing? Overall, the last column for this, where it says total, we are overall doing okay in all of the states except for Pennsylvania. With the plans that Maryland and Virginia have put in place, the trajectory looks like they will meet the 2025 goals. That being said, we're going to have to make sure that the implementation and the funding stays on track to follow through with those plans, because the plan is only as good as what it results in on the ground. Pennsylvania, it'll come as no surprise to anyone on this committee, is far behind, with the exception of their wastewater treatment plant upgrades. The plan that Pennsylvania put in this last year doesn't even meet the full loads that it's required to, and has a significant funding shortfall. They just do not pass the same level of funding or policy measures that you all pass in the Maryland General Assembly. There are many people working very hard in Pennsylvania, but they just do not have the same resources that we have been fortunate enough to have in Maryland, making it a real struggle. And with Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia making up 90% of the pollution requirements that need to be met, unless Pennsylvania gets on track, we are going to have a tough time meeting 2025. And I'll discuss that more at the end of the presentation. For Maryland, how are we doing? Overall, we are on track to meet 2025. And that is due in very large part because of reductions in wastewater treatment plants and reductions that we've made to date in agriculture. Without those two sectors, we would not be on track. They are making up the shortfall that we are seeing in agriculture, the growing shortfall, or in some parts of agriculture, the growing shortfall that we're seeing in urban and suburban runoff. So if we are going to maintain these reductions, we have to step it up in the other sources. Because if not, once the wastewater treatment plant upgrades are done, we're not going to have other pounds of pollution reductions to turn to. The wastewater treatment plants, I think we are up to about 64 of the 67 major wastewater treatment plants are upgraded. We've started on minors and are ahead of schedule throughout the state on those minors. Again, those additional reductions are carrying us, making the total green for Maryland. Urban suburban runoff continues to be off track. This is our, kind of past development patterns before we knew any better. It is also the continual conversion of our natural landscape, farms and forests being put into the urban suburban sector and being developed. If this continues, it will be the largest source in Maryland by 2025. It will, kind of surpass some of the other sources. So what do we need to do? There's a number of outdated permits that are up before Maryland Department of the Environment right now. We have the municipal separate storm sewer permits, the MS4s, as they're affectionately known. We have the construction general permit, and we also have the industrial stormwater permit. They're all before MDE and out. I think 2 of the 3 are out for public comment right now. These permits have to ramp things up, but unfortunately, they're actually requiring less going forward than in the previous round of permits. This is particularly true for those MS4 permits. I recognize that these permits are expensive, but there are different practices that can be chosen, tree plantings, natural filters, that are less expensive practices that still achieve our nitrogen and phosphorus reduction goals. For the construction permits, we have to account for the stronger storms that we're having. The standard that is in there when there's an active construction site is just not cutting it anymore. Even with construction sites that follow all the practices, neighbors and others go by and see the discharge, the muddy water running off a construction site after a storm. So we need to increase the controls that we have when there's active construction going on. And for our industrial permits, these are often in areas that have had a disproportionate amount of pollution in those communities over the years. So we have to account for that in the industrial permits and make sure that the communities are getting cleaner, not just tolerating pollution year over year. So again, these are up before Maryland Department of the Environment right now. I expect that there will be pieces of legislation to try to direct the agency in some of these areas, especially when it comes to accounting for climate in our next round of permitting. But if we want to see that urban suburban runoff change from red to even yellow, we have to change the practices that we're putting in place. I would be remiss not to talk about climate change when we're talking about the state of the Bay. The reality is we're having increased rainfall. More importantly, and from an impact standpoint, we're having these severe storms that cause the flash flooding, the deluge that overwhelm our systems that we have in place, like I mentioned with the construction sites. Climate will impact how hard it is to meet the 2025 goals. All of the jurisdictions are going to have to come up with additional pollution reductions, and they need their plans by 2022 on how they're going to get there. The reality is that as the water temperatures warm, that holds less oxygen, and oxygen is one of the drivers that we are trying to improve for the Chesapeake Bay. That is what sets those pollution limits, is what does that pollution do to the amount of oxygen in the water that allows for a thriving ecosystem. With it holding less water, less oxygen, it means more improvements are going to have to be made elsewhere. What we'd like to see Maryland do going forward on this, it's going to have to be multi-pronged. It's going to have to be source reduction. It's going to have to be mitigation and resiliency strategies. For state investments, we're going to have to look to where we can get a 2-fer or a 3-fer. It's going to have to address water quality. It's going to have to address climate change, flooding, resiliency, where that Venn diagram all comes together. That's where we need to be putting our money going forward. What are the practices that help communities with all of these issues? It is no longer that we can just pick a best management practice that is good for water quality when there is one that is good for water quality and helps with climate. Air deposition. This is something that the federal level largely controls. We've seen significant backslides over the last 4 years. We're hoping that the next administration reverses some of those regulatory changes because the air deposition is a significant source. And so if we can cut that down, we will help with our climate change requirements. And I'll touch on this a little bit more when we get to our 2021 legislative priorities. Normally, if we were doing this in January, I would be able to unveil the scorecard, the State of the Bay scorecard, the letter grade for how the Bay is doing. But we're doing this in December. It's not published yet, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek on what we are seeing. Those of you familiar with this report, this is the letter grade. This is the, A, B, and C. Are we getting there? Are we not getting there? We look at 13 different indicators that are divided up into pollution, habitat, and fisheries. Unfortunately, we've seen grades that I know at least my parents never would have paid for if I was in college and getting the grades that the Bay is getting. But we are seeing improvement. Again, the blueprint, all the efforts on the ground for the last few decades, the grade is slowly improving, but probably not as quickly as some of us would like to see. The goal is not to get to 100. It's not to get to that perfect grade anymore. It never was. The goal is to get to a 70. Because the reality is the 100 is before this watershed was developed. A 70 would mean a system where it is in balance and taking care of itself, where we have healthy environments for the different critters that habit the watershed and healthy environments for the population that lives here, as well as a healthy economy. So again, the goal is 70. This was the 2018 scorecard. I just wanted you to see so that you could see the different indicators. Again, pollution is one category, habitat is another category, and fisheries is the other. I don't expect big movement in the overall grade. Unfortunately, I think we will still be a D+, but there are positives within it. The pollution indicators, we're going to see improvements this year. I don't know exactly where the number is going to end up, but there's going to be positive movement. We know from reports that came out from Department of Natural Resources and Virginia Marine Institute of Science, VIMS, or actually it's VIMS, Virginia Institute of Marine Science, that we had a smaller dead zone, one of the smallest that we've had in the last few decades. That's good because it means that there are more areas of the Bay, more parts of the summer that had higher oxygen levels, and that's what we need to be seeing. We also know that the more oxygen that's in that water, the system, all these chemical reactions start to happen, and it makes some of the pollution that is in there unavailable. It locks it in. It doesn't recirculate it throughout the system. So again, that's why we're really looking at that dissolved oxygen number. Because of all the policies that this committee has put in place and the funding from the General Assembly in Maryland and in Virginia, again, lesser extent Pennsylvania, we're going to see the nitrogen and phosphorus numbers likely improve as well. Not big jumps, but we are seeing trends on many of the monitoring stations that there are improvements. Habitat's going to be a little bit of a mixed story. We are not on track with our forest buffers. We need more of them. The states have committed to more of them, but we're just not getting them in at pace. And again, we're still losing them in other instances as well. Underwater grasses have taken a hit, especially in 2019, because we look at a 2-year period. There was a significant hit in 2019, and while there was a comeback in 2020, it's not going to be enough to take us back to where we were in 2018 with underwater grasses. Fisheries, there's going to be some improvement, but there is going to be a significant downgrading when it comes to rockfish. I don't think that will come as a surprise to anyone. There's been many news stories about this. When we did the report in 2018, we knew that there was going to be a new stock assessment coming out for rockfish. So we kind of alluded that change was on the way. What we didn't realize is just how poor the results of that stock assessment were going to be. It showed even lower levels of rockfish, coupled that with poor spawning years the last year, and there is going to have to be some increased management around rockfish. Maryland and Virginia both took measures this year to change the fishing seasons and then sometimes close some of the tournament fishing. Question remains on if that's going to be enough. Was it timed correctly? Was it closed long enough? Much of the height of the rockfish fishing season comes when the water is the warmest. So if you pull up a fish that's not a keeper and you throw it back, the survival rate goes way down. So we're going to have to look to make sure that we are closing it when those fish are most at risk. Again, Maryland put measures in place, but the science will tell us whether or not that's helping enough with mortality that when they go back in and do another stock assessment, if we're seeing improvement. So when this report comes out, we'll get it to you one way or another, carrier pigeon if we have to. There'll be an electronic copy of it, I'm sure. We'll probably produce a limited number of paper copies or at least a PDF that's a good print quality that if you want a hard copy, we can make that happen.
Is that it?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I thought you'd ended. Go
No.
ahead.
Just a few quick ones. So what does this mean? What is CBF going to work on in 2021? Based on the climate concerns that I shared, based on the fact that we continue to be behind on our tree goals, and knowing that we have limited budgeted resources, we are again going to focus on trees and focus on trees as part of the climate solutions bill. That is an omnibus bill. There will be a tree planting component of this bill, a 5 million tree goal by 2030. There's a carve out for urban tree planting because we know from a public health standpoint, from a heat island, from energy cost related to the summer months, the more trees we have in that urban environment, the better. We are going to increase technical assistance to help get these trees on the ground, both in the agricultural, urban, and suburban settings. We're going to try to leverage the partnerships that are already out there planting trees because there's a lot of resources going towards it already. And we're going to try to see if there's going to be a carbon market that could help incentivize this tree goal as well. The reality is for water quality, for climate, for community resiliency, trees is where the investment needs to go. For our forests, it helps offset about 15% of the state's total carbon dioxide emissions. The carbon captured by existing trees helped make the difference of Maryland meeting the 25% reduction by 2020 in greenhouse gas. So the more we have, the more it's going to help us with our carbon sequestration goals. It'll help us meet our watershed improvement plan goals. And if we invest more in trees, it's going to help us with those additional pounds that Maryland now needs to find related to climate change. So this will be a focus of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation this coming year with many of our partners. There's other important components to this omnibus bill around climate related to Empower Maryland, vehicle electrification when it comes to buses and passenger vehicles, some standards around new state buildings and what they have to be net neutral in terms of their energy use, emission reductions from existing large buildings. So it's a multi-pronged approach to climate, but the tree component is the one for Chesapeake Bay Foundation where we see the intersection the most with our water quality goals. We'll be keeping an eye on the budget to make sure the environment doesn't take any disproportionate hits. We recognize that economic times are hard. We don't know if there's going to be a stimulus package coming out of Washington, D.C. So we have to pay attention to our spending, which again, cost-effective, targeted. We know those practices. We know where they need to go. We have to make sure all of our funding sources related to the environment take that approach. We will be working to try to restore education funding that was zeroed out to Chesapeake Bay Foundation last year. We don't know if it will be in this coming budget. We were unable to restore it last year, but we know we need that next generation of students out on the water because they are going to be the advocates and see this all through when we are all hopefully retired. The last thing I'm going to mention, and I'm going to skip my last slide, is that I mentioned how far behind Pennsylvania is. Their General Assembly just doesn't have the gumption that you all have. It doesn't have the drive throughout the state that we need in Pennsylvania. But what we saw these last few years is that EPA just stepped back in its responsibilities. It is the keeper of the Clean Water Act. It is the one that was here to partner with the states, but also to enforce the Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint. Instead, they let Pennsylvania turn in a plan that didn't even reach the goals and had a significant funding shortfall. There was early on talk under previous administrations of consequences and additional resources, and we just didn't see that come from EPA at a time that we are 5 years out from the cleanup goals. So in September, Chesapeake Bay Foundation and our partners filed suit against the Environmental Protection Agency in federal court for the District of Columbia. We have said that they have failed to uphold their Clean Water Act responsibilities. We think that there needs to be a new plan out of Pennsylvania with consequences, with teeth. We think that EPA needs to work with its federal partners and come up with more resources to get to Pennsylvania. Attorneys generals in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. also filed a suit that same day in September, alleging the same shortfalls of the Environmental Protection Agency. Those cases have since been combined. EPA has moved to do a motion to dismiss, and we are going to fight that. And we are hoping that since court cases take a long time, that when things change over in January, maybe they'll be willing to sit down at the table and have a discussion on how to reach our shared goals and how they can step up in terms of responsibility. But we will continue. We don't like to resort to legal action, but with, again, only 5 years left and one state glaringly behind and an EPA that is no longer doing its duty, we felt like we were left with no option. We're working very closely with the Attorney General of Maryland on this case. Attorney General Frosch, I'm sure will come as no surprise to any of you, is very involved, having been an advocate for the Bay for many years when he was in the Senate. So with that, I will put up our contact information and then I will stop sharing my screen. You have a copy of this and you have a copy of the 2020 State of the Blueprint report. And as soon as the new scorecard comes out, I will be sure to get that to you as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Allison. And we'll hold questions until the end of Ann Swanson's presentation. So with no further ado, Ann, take it away. You need to unmute yourself. There you go.
All right, let's see. Can you see a screen yet?
No, I can't.
Okay, let's see. Okay.
There you go. There you
All
go.
right. All right, so now let me just. Okay, can you see that?
Can.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So
And that's the one with your notes, though. That one has your notes. Did you want to just do the slides?
Oh, yeah, no, I want the other one. Okay, hold on. Let
There
me, 1 second.
That's up.
Oh, you have the correct one now?
Yep.
Okay, with no notes.
No notes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much to both Chairman Barbe and Subcommittee Chairman Stein for having this briefing and for just providing us with this extraordinary opportunity year after year to bring information to you. A lot of the information coming out of the Bay program, it changes, annually. The numbers are hard to keep track of. And so hopefully between Allison and I will give you, the story, at least as we know it, of how the Bay is doing and how you are doing in your efforts to address it. For my part, most of you have already met me. I serve as the executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, but I want to also introduce Morel King, who is with me today. She is our Pennsylvania director. She's been with us for 15 years now. Morel is a lawyer. She works directly with the Pennsylvania General Assembly and the stakeholders in Pennsylvania. She's also from a long standing dairy family. And if you've been up in Pennsylvania, there's a chance you've actually eaten her family's ice cream. So between me, trained as a forest ecologist and wildlife biologist, and Morel, hopefully we can round out Allison and Robin's questions you have later. So I want to just begin by saying that Bruce Beriano actually sent me a quote on Tuesday, and it basically said, if in trying times are no time to stop trying. And I want to like start the conversation there and end the conversation there, because as you will see from this presentation, we are halfway to our goal. And that's in the face of the population growing by half. It's against, in many ways, all odds when you think of it, estuary as shallow as the Chesapeake Bay with such an enormous watershed. So what I would say is, first of all, if you look at this progress, and I'm going to show you these graphs, you're going to see your work. The General Assemblies, probably more than anything else in the watershed, have affected the health of the Chesapeake Bay. And so what I would just say is, watch your work, know it matters, know the decisions each session that you make deeply matter, and keep going. Because the first thing that I will say, and the last, is in trying times, don't stop trying. So with that, most of you are familiar with the Chesapeake Bay Commission, but just in case a few of you are not, the Chesapeake Bay Commission is a tri-state legislative commission. It was created by state law in all 3 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And the bottom line in terms of what we do is we work to translate science into both federal and state policy. So we have people working in all 3 states, as well as the federal government, to try to deliver those resources, work with you to best understand the science, what's happening, and therefore the best policy moves going forward. In terms of who's at the table for the commission, there are 21 members. This is kind of an interesting schematic to just sort of say who's at the table. The blue chairs are your chairs. Those are House members. In Maryland, we have each delegation is 7 members. So in Maryland, on the Senate side, it's Senator Gazzoni and Senator Elfreth. And on the House side, it's delegates Stein, Love, and Bridges. So that's who makes up the legislative members on the commission. Also, each governor has a designee. In the case of Maryland, it's Secretary Hathaway Riccio. And then rounding it out for the citizen member is retired Senator Mac Middleton. The commission in many ways brings the legislative branch to the Bay Program, in that when you look at the construct of the Bay Program and the leadership, it's basically all 6 states in the watershed in the District of Columbia, the EPA, which represents the 7 major federal agencies that are involved in the Bay cleanup, and then there's the Chesapeake Bay Commission. So we really try to provide that continuity from a legislative point of view. By way of background, the Bay restoration is not new at all. In fact, it really started in the 1960s with very strong visual declines. All of you over the years, depending upon how long you've served in the General Assembly, you've heard many, many references to the Bay Agreements. Those Bay Agreements over time, each built on the last agreement. And in each situation, those Bay Agreements triggered enormous legislative action. So for example, if you look in 1983, that Bay Agreement then triggered things like critical areas or the agricultural cost share programs or sediment erosion control programs in Maryland, to give you a few. If you keep going and you look at the 87 and then 2000 agreements, after each one, there was a layering of legislation, whether that's the Bay Restoration Fund or the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays Trust Fund or the MAX program, the rain tax, enhancements to program open space, rockfish moratoriums, changes in crabs and oysters. They're all things that come through your committee. What I'm going to try to do is really focus us into the red areas on this chart and really try to explore a little bit what happened with the TMDL. Allison has mentioned it already, basically what's happening in terms of water quality. I'll try to focus there in the limited time that we have here. So basically what I'll tell you is if you look at this chart, what you can see is each Bay Agreement had a lot to do with water quality. It had a lot to do with water quality, and we were laying down all kinds of efforts to better control the nutrients that the EPA study told us were our problem. And that was nitrogen and phosphorus. They also told us that clarity was a really big problem, and that has to do a lot with sediment. So over the years, we did an extraordinary lift to try to address it. And in 2008, we acknowledged that our approach at the state level was not going to be enough to be complying with the Federal Clean Water Act, and that we, in fact, had to bring on what the Bay Foundation calls the pollution diet, a total maximum daily load that gives you a cap on the amount of pollution that can come into the water, and you can still have clean water. Anything above that cap is excess. Essentially, it's the part you need to reduce. So you're never trying to get to zero. You're trying to get a level of essentially nutrient or sediment intake that is healthy to an estuarine system, no more. So that's what happened in 2010. And then in 2014, this is important, the states voluntarily again acknowledged that yes, we were on a trajectory to meet our clean water goals established in the TMDL, and we would give it, we were committed to it. We weren't just being forced to do it. And that's important. And the bottom line goal is 2025. So I'll take you on a whirlwind tour to essentially show you where are we in this process. Again, we established it in 2010. 2017, we were supposed to have 60% of the practices in place to achieve clean water. 2019 is when we did the third of our watershed implementation plans. That's your plan for how to achieve your diet. It's what you're going to do in order to achieve those reductions. And in 2025, you don't have to have clean water. You need to have the practices in place that will deliver clean water, because sometimes there's a lag. So that's what's happening right now. And this is a complicated slide, but I'm going to take you through this because this is important stuff. And if I'm sorry that we're on Zoom, because I always appreciated in a hearing room when I could see someone's face. I could see if they were puzzling or they had a question or I was annoying them. And here I really can't see that. So let me try to take you through this.
You're not annoying us.
This first column is 1985. The second column is 2018, 33 years later. These two columns, for purpose of scale, just remember, between this column and this column is 7 years, not another 33. And time matters. Okay, so between 1985 and 2018, we basically reduced the pollutant load by 83 million pounds. Over these 8 years, and I'm going to give you even more updated information in a minute, we have to reduce by 52 million pounds. So the first thing is just understand that the pounds per year is substantial. Now, fortunately, between here and this is Bay-wide, and I'm going to show you Maryland specific, but the level of effort here changes. Part of this, take note, where did we get the pollutant load from? Allison already told you our waste treatment plants. Never underestimate the impact of that Bay Restoration Fund and what you have achieved at those large sewage treatment plants. That effort and that achievement is actually worth world recognition, not certainly national. You are the envy of the nation, but it's actually more than that. And so we made that early gain on the backs of waste treatment, and that happened everywhere. It happened in Pennsylvania, it happened in Virginia, it happened in Maryland, and in all three states, they are at goal in terms of their waste treatment plans. Now, where do we have to get it from in the future? In the future, we really don't have a lot more to gain from waste treatment. Where the lion's share of the opportunity is in agriculture. And the difference in terms of what you can achieve with agriculture versus waste treatment is substantially different. Agriculture is very, very challenging, requires a lot of technical assistance and a lot of cost share as well. So I want to leave you with those specific things in terms of this chart. Okay, what about Maryland? This is just another way to look at essentially what's been happening. In the last 34 years, Maryland achieved 33 million pounds. So the math is convenient here in that it's about 1 million pounds per year. They achieved 22 million pounds from wastewater and about 10 million pounds from agriculture. Okay, so that tells you what were they able to achieve with all those programs that you set up for them. In terms, the other thing I want you to watch is the pink line, and I want you to watch the yellow line here, because what you can see is that the load is not shrinking. It's supposed, each one of these is supposed to be getting smaller. And in this case, they are growing. Okay, so that's important to understand in terms of your future focus. Maryland's loads from 2019 to 2025. This is the challenge. Okay, the last slide basically said, where did you, the progress that you made? If you look at this slide, you can see that you have to go from 52 million pounds, that's your diet, and you have to get it down to 45.8. You have to achieve in these years 6.2 million pounds. So the good news is it's still about 1 million pounds a year. But the bad news is that it's not controllable from a point source. Your load has to come from non-point source, and your strategies end up being quite different. If you look at the agricultural contributions in the past and the amount that they achieved, and you look at the future, depending upon how you do the math, it's somewhere between an 8 and 11-fold increase in effort. So know that as you're looking at programs to invest in the General Assembly, that the agricultural load still needs substantial help. Now, where are we? Where are we in terms of our effort thus far? And this slide is important. You learned that you had to have practices in place, 60% of the practices in place by 2017. So if you look here at 60%, what I can tell you is that Virginia made its mark. Maryland was just a smidgen under its mark. Pennsylvania was way off, as Allison has described. If you look here, what you'll see is for the 2019, we have 2-year milestones. You can see that Maryland is further off than you'd want Maryland to be, given that Maryland is a Maine bay state and Pennsylvania has no bay frontage. So to me, Maryland and Virginia must be on track if we are expecting any of the other states to seriously pull their weight. Okay, I've talked to you a lot about agricultural conservation and the kind of pressure that's on agriculture right now to deliver the remaining load. Across the watershed, 60% of the future reductions have to come from 8 BMPs. When you look at the watershed implementation plans, that's where it's coming from. So that's important. these are the agricultural practices. And what you can see, if you really look at them, you can see that animal agriculture is key. So are trees, they are key. Any kind of a buffer. And then, of course, any of the practices that just essentially stop the runoff, whether that's continuous high residue, cover crops, things like that. Okay, so that's really where we're getting most of it. I want to pause here and say another thing just about, we started to analyze agricultural progress in the watershed. Had one state made a lot more progress than another? Because then, of course, you want to know why. And it was interesting because both Maryland and Virginia, when we started this in '85, ag was their highest load. In Virginia, it was actually wastewater. So let's look at Maryland and Pennsylvania. In 2019, Maryland accomplished about 11 million pound reduction from agriculture. Pennsylvania achieved 12 million pounds in 2019. Okay, maybe that was just an anomaly. So we looked at all the years from '85 to 2019. And what we found was that about 339 million pounds were reduced from ag in Maryland, and about 362 million pounds from Pennsylvania. So what you can see is there's a certain limit unless you have more manpower and more cost effectiveness, more technical assistance out there to get agriculture really boosted. Okay. Our members, particularly Delegate Stein and Delegate Love on the House side, have really said, you know, okay, what about Conowingo? What about climate change? And I know so many of you have asked the same. So what we tried to do is characterize it in some very simple math here. What is happening with those two? Remember that when the Conowingo, when the original Bay Agreement was, not Bay Agreement, TMDL was established, we thought that the dam was still trapping nutrients and sediment behind the dam, and that it would function that way through 2025. Well, it doesn't anymore. It reached what's called dynamic equilibrium, where now, even in a low flow storm, it comes over the dam. So what's that load? What's that new load? Because obviously those are new, like calories coming into the body, so to speak, and you've got to incorporate them into your diet, right? So take a look at this math. First of all, in Bay-wide, I told you that we had 52 million pounds remaining for nitrogen reduction. The impact of Conowingo is another 6 million pounds. Now, the other thing that has just come forward is that there's 5 million more pounds that need to be accounted for because of the impact of climate change. What that means is your goal now is not an additional reduction of 52.5 million pounds, it's 63.5. So you might be thinking, well, what about Maryland? What about Maryland? The numbers are not final and they haven't been agreed to, but this is the best we know right now. In Maryland, basically the math goes from 6.2 million pounds to 7.5 million. So your lift is greater, and the place where you're going to find those additional pounds remains agriculture, stormwater, septic, because for the most part, you've addressed wastewater. Now here's one slide basically relating to climate change. It gives you some of the facts you might want to know. What you can see is because of climate change, there will be increased flow. If you're a number person, here's the impact. If you want to know if it's really going to impact you, the darker the color, the worse your situation, find your district. And this is essentially what's going to happen. What you can see is the greatest impacts are actually in the upper watershed, but be concerned about places in here because of course that's right where it enters the Chesapeake Bay. The nitrogen loads will increase, the phosphorus loads will increase, the sediment loads will increase. Now, the other thing that's going to happen is, of course, sea levels are rising. And you can see here, 2025, they're expecting a rise of, essentially about, less than a foot, but nonetheless important here in terms of this. So the load factors will all be addressed. Now, here's the thing. Originally, we thought the impact of climate change would be 9 million pounds by 2025. What we learned is it's only 5 million. And there are reasons for that. For example, if there's more water in the bay because of sea level rise, you can count on dilution to lower the impact. The flip of it is we have these more violent storms tearing essentially soil from the watershed and delivering phosphorus and, of course, sediment. So that increases the impact. So there's mitigating factors in both directions, and then in the end, it ends up being about 5 million pounds. What about Conowingo? Well, I mentioned with Conowingo that the Conowingo Dam is no longer capturing the sediment that we had hoped for, and so it is tumbling over and into the Chesapeake Bay. The Principal Staff Committee, which oversees the Bay Program, decided in 2017 that the Conowingo load, that 6 million pounds, would be separated. It would have its own WIP, its own watershed implementation plan. And that watershed implementation plan was actually just released for public comment. The estimated cost of that plan is about $53 million a year. Keep in mind that Pennsylvania already, for its other WIP, has a funding gap of 324 million pounds a year. Also, keep in mind that graph that I showed you that showed Maryland still needed to catch up. So the fact that there is a Conowingo WIP with an estimated cost of an additional 53 million pounds is very significant. The other thing is that in that WIP, the level of implementation to be achieved is large. And I want to pause there and say very large. For example, it calls for over 600,000 acres of nitrogen-based nutrient management. That's not there now. Or 216 acres of conservation tillage. That's not there now. And so the financing strategy is supposed to be released in its first iteration in December, and then its final in March. The thing I want to warn you, that I've warned every member of the commission, we have not seen this finance strategy yet, but from what they're saying, the partnership, meaning the states, the federal government, the District of Columbia, would be responsible for funding it. And how that would happen, I don't know. So where are we in terms of the Chesapeake Bay? Well, there are first of all, the grades all over the map. You can find grades where you're getting an A, you can find grades where you're getting an F, you can find D's and B's. And what I just want to say is that our glass is half full. It's half empty, depending upon what you want to say. While the population grew by half, in 1985, it was about 12 million. It's now about 18 million. What we basically were able to do is reduce the nitrogen coming into the bay by about a quarter and the phosphorus by about 50%. The result of that is that the dead zone, that red part that has no oxygen in the summer, or the yellow zone that has low, is shrinking. And what you will particularly notice here is the yellow is shrinking. And you'll also see that first you see the impacts in the tributaries before you see the goodness happening in the main stem. So what I would say, in 2020, the Maryland DNR announced we had the second smallest dead zone in the history of monitoring, which began in 1985. And for Virginia, it was the 7th smallest in the last 35 years. So this session, what is the Chesapeake Bay Commission thinking about, given what I've just told you? Well, for one, you have an opportunity. The Clean Water Commerce Act sunsets in June of 2021. That's the piece of the Bay Restoration Fund that you set aside essentially for procurement, for cost-effective practices. Many of our legislators are appropriators. They began looking at the WIP, looking at what it was investing in, what the BRF was going to pay for. And what they began to say is, well, wait a minute. I think that we might need to readdress how we're spending this money. Now, up until now, the Clean Water Commerce Act invested $4 million in 2018, $6 million in 2019, and $10 in the years 2020 and 2021. So the question is, what did we get for that, and how do we need to change that? And here's, at least right now, where the commission is. The commission has established a work group. Chesapeake Bay Commission is on it, as is the Farm Bureau and MML and MACO. And, we're trying to work with a broad sector in the community. And what we're asking is, what should we do with the Clean Water Commerce Act to invest? Admittedly, we have our eyes very, very focused on the achievement of the 2025 goal. The Bay Restoration Fund was originally intended for that purpose. And so we want to keep the integrity of that going. And we asked ourselves, what could we do? Well, what we think is that you should extend it to 2030. And the reason for 2030 is that's when the BRF reverts to the old fees. And so it would give you an opportunity to look at both simultaneously. We think you should increase that strategic procurement using cost effectiveness as your lens to 20 million. We think you should focus on nitrogen. That's where the pitfalls are the worst. And that's where we think you can make the greatest progress. And we also think you should remove the exclusion for the agricultural community. And we have not heard any pushback at all from the agricultural community by that. We think you should create some sector-based incentives or set-asides, one for agriculture, one for DEIJ-related, environmental justice-related issues, and one specifically for landscape restoration to get at some of the issues that Allison has been raising about really co-benefits, things like the importance of trees, particularly forest situation. And so, the other thing I want to mention here is the ag reductions, that the ag reductions should come from permanent practices. The other thing that Allison mentioned was the budgets. In the end, the budgets drive everything. They really do. And investments in these programs matter deeply. And so what we just wanted to do is to really highlight that as we look to this TMDL in 2025, we need to focus more than ever on our technical assistance and cost share assistance programs, because they really will achieve. In Maryland is relying 50% of the remaining load is supposed to come from those agricultural programs. The other thing is stay the course in terms of your point sources. That's where you've made the investments. Keep going, make sure they're maintained, make sure they're operational, because that deeply matters. And then in terms of stormwater and septic remain to be growing in the wrong direction. So keep your eye there to make sure that you're maximizing the requirements of new development and retrofits of any development to try to maximize what you can do with the existing built landscape. So those really were my slides, Mr. Chairman. Many thanks to Delegate Stein, who is helping us to get the Commission's annual report, which is a 40-year history of legislation in the 3 states and federal initiatives. There's also a 7 or 9 minute video that's online that is helping to tell the Commission's story. This is the Commission's 40th year. So with that, I thank you all. I hope that you get the hard copy of the annual report. It's also posted electronically for your use. And one last thing is also in the materials that we provided to the staff, we included a one-pager that really outlines the differences in the 3 states. Each state is remarkably different, and we really do straddle the Mason-Dixon line, and it is alive and well, particularly in terms of government construct. And in Pennsylvania, it's really townships and boroughs and cities that rule, not counties, with 1,250 independent decision makers in the watershed. And so you've got to keep in mind that in Pennsylvania, 60% of the land in Pennsylvania is in the watershed, but only 30% of the population. So the voters that drive the General Assembly's decisions are not in this watershed, which means however we help Pennsylvania, we need to help statewide, essentially, or particularly if we're relying on legislative action. So with that, I thank you very, very much for listening. I hope that we've answered your questions, and we hope if you have others, we can answer those as well.
Anne, thank you very much. Terrific presentation as always. I always look forward to this briefing, and I certainly look forward to the 40-year history of legislative accomplishment by the 3 states. I suppose the Pennsylvania portion of that will be nice and short. So we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to have the vice chair recognize the questioners in the order in which they've been asked to ask questions, but I'm going first. And it isn't so much a question as it is a statement about global climate change. As you know, I and many of the members of my committee are very committed to fighting global climate change. But I have to say that of all the sources of pollution to the Bay, global climate change is the one that's truly global. I mean, a lot of it are items that we don't have any control over. We don't have any control over coal-fired power plants in Ohio or in the Midwest or or anywhere. And so I imagine pollution in Maryland and Virginia would have the greatest impact on the water in the Bay, but there's still a great impact from around the nation. And it's hard. It's going to be hard for. I thank you for making note of the fact that climate change is important, but it's going to be hard for Maryland by itself to address that. That's really more comment than a question, unless you want to respond to that.
Well, I know for me, one of the things that I want to say here is that I agree, first of all, that things have to happen at a global and a national scale. They really do. But I also think that each state can do things to help, but also to protect themselves from the reality. The seas are rising. Flooding will occur. Rain will change. So the question is what can you do about it? One of the things that I think is really important is to constantly be asking the questions, are the best management practices that we are relying on equipped to deal with this climate change? Are there certain practices we should be choosing, because of that? And I would think that would be very prudent, because you don't want to lose the progress you made. You do not want to lose that. So I would counsel the committee there.
Okay. Dana, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to echo your thanks to Allison and Ann for their presentations. It's always important that we get a briefing on the update of the Bay at the start of session, so thank you. We do have a number of delegates with questions. I'll announce the order in which their hands were raised, and so they include Delegate Healy, who will go first, then Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, Delegate Boyce, Delegate Love, Delegate Harrison, Delegate Otto, and then Delegate Jacobs. So Delegate Healy, if you want to start the questioning, please do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair, and thank you both to Ann and Allison about all of these presentations. I look forward to them every year, and it's always helpful. I do have a question about the relative, the various sectors, the urban versus the agriculture versus all the other kinds of things, the runoff, the wastewater, everything. One of the things that stood out to me in the very first presentation was how continuing development of the urban and suburban areas and some of the agricultural land being developed and the impact that's having. But I was wondering if you have a chart or something that shows the impact it has overall as these things happen, not just, there's more pressure on urban because there's more urban land and less on agriculture when there's less agriculture land, but the overall impact of that kind of shifting of land use has on the blueprint and the TMDL and all of that. So maybe just a very quick, if you have a chart, that would be perfect. You could send it later maybe. But if you could just give us like an overview of how these trends are affecting the overall numbers.
So Delegate Healy, I will be sure to get you a chart because there is one that the Chesapeake Bay Program, their land use work group, puts out that shows just what this has meant over time in terms of the change in sector. So not the portion of the urban suburban load that's from past development, but what we're seeing over time in terms of the change and what that means in pounds. Because you're right that as the pounds shift to the urban suburban sector, they shift out often of the forest sector, because there is a forest sector, and shift out of the agricultural sector. So there is a delta. The problem is that once it is in the urban and suburban load, it is harder to treat and no longer has the filter capacity. So while the pounds are shifting categories, once they're in that urban suburban, the impact is greater because the solution for those pounds now are much more limited. They don't have the filter. So it's kind of a twofer. You get more in the sector and it's a harder one to control once it's there. And because it's a hardened piece of land now without that natural filter. But I will get the chart from the Bay Program that just shows the trends over time going into that sector.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Delegate Frazier-Hidalgo.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and Chair. Thank you both. I always learn something, as I say, every year. So thanks for that. I guess a big thank you for the lawsuit in Pennsylvania. I've been kind of pushing on this, as both of you know, for, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years now. So I'm so happy. I know it's very complicated. So I'm so happy to see that. I'm not happy to see that that's what we had to do. It's very unfortunate that that's what we had to do, but I'm happy that we're finally doing it. And it's not everything we want, right? Because it's against the EPA. So as opposed to how do we leverage Pennsylvania to actually do the things that they're supposed to do, as opposed to having to ask Pennsylvania to, having to ask the EPA to do it. So my real question is, it's kind of a two-parter, and that is, what leverage can we have? Like, so we're going after the EPA. What other leverage can you see or have ideas on for Maryland to affect the General Assembly or the citizens of Pennsylvania to attract more attention, and for the General Assembly to take the issues of Pennsylvania dumping into Maryland more seriously? Because that seems to be the crux of one of the problems since I've been on the committee. It's kind of the same thing. Well, you know, the General Assembly this, the General Assembly that, it's really, really hard. So is there any out of the box ideas that you can think of that the General Assembly can take up to really try to impact the Pennsylvania General Assembly and the voters there? That's the first part of my question.
Well, Merrill King, who's on for the Pennsylvania office of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, is probably the expert on the screen, along with Ann on this. You know, the out of the box, and I don't think it's necessarily for the Maryland General Assembly to the Pennsylvania General Assembly, but I actually think we have to start talking to Pennsylvanians less about the Bay and more about their local waters. The Bay is just not as much of a real thing for them. So it's not that they don't take lightly on dumping on the Bay, but like we need them to care about their local water and stop sending pollution into their local waters. And then that will help the Bay. I think when we come up to Pennsylvania with a very Bay focused message, and listen, this has been a hard one for Chesapeake Bay Foundation to, you know, come around to. We have Bay right in our name. But the reality is we need to make it about the local communities up there. We also need to have a broader water message in Pennsylvania so that we can get Philadelphia and Pittsburgh involved and at the table, because that is where the population centers are. That is where a lot of the power is concentrated. And so if we have a local message and a message that resonates with those two population centers, I think we can start to shift the General Assembly in investing in clean water that will have that downstream impact. But again, you have the Pennsylvania director for the Chesapeake Bay Commission on here, who probably has the best ideas of the group.
So where I would add there is that in Pennsylvania for quite some time now, we have had a focus on local water. And really, when you think about it, if Pennsylvania has clean water, then we don't have an issue with what's happening coming down. Now, right now in Pennsylvania, by way of background, you need to know that Pennsylvania has the largest intact hardwood forests in the United States. So Pennsylvania, they can really look downstream at Maryland and say, what the hell happened to your forests? I mean, they can. And so in that sense, they have a lot going for them. They're also producing more agricultural product that we're all eating than most of the other states combined. And so the statistics are staggering. So what we've tried to do is work with Pennsylvania to develop a water fund, essentially showing them the data that comes from Maryland and Virginia about what you were able to purchase if you established a water fund like your BRF that spread the burden across the population. We've been focused on you need to do that Commonwealth-wide, because we know if you do it everywhere, there's impaired waters in Pennsylvania everywhere. Pennsylvania has the largest density, stream density of any state in the continental United States. They have more water than the other states. And so with that comes impairments, you know. So we've been trying to do that. Morel, and I really want you to hear from her, is we've been working on a water bill. We've been working on a Pennsylvania farm bill, essentially to do cost share. And the Bay Foundation has been really working very hard on that. And we've been working on a fertilizer bill. The other thing is the cultures in each of the state's general assemblies are really very different. Pennsylvania, Maryland comes at it and goes, yeah, and let's do it. And then you do it like in a single session. But it kind of brews behind the scenes before. In Pennsylvania, I've seen that most big pieces of legislation take 7, 8 years to pass. It's just a different culture. Just that's some background. I don't think that if we walk into the Pennsylvania General Assemblies and we say we're from the Bay and we're mad, that it works. It just won't work. It won't motivate them at all. What they want is your help. So, and the last thing I want to say is the members of the Bay Commission, they're the ones carrying the environmental legislation up in Pennsylvania. So please don't beat on them, because if you turn them away, there's nobody carrying the environmental legislation. Certainly not in the administration, in the chambers right now, but not the chambers, the parties that matter. So, Morel, please join in.
It's hard. Thank you. It's hard for me to add to any of that. Just to reiterate the point that Anne made earlier, it is over half of our state, but it's only a third of our population, and that's reflected in the General Assembly representation from the watershed. Out of 253 members, only 88 are from the Bay watershed. There are 4 major watersheds that cover Pennsylvania, 6 if you break it down into the rivers. So the Bay is just one of those 4. The Potomac and the Susquehanna are 2 of those 6. And the power centers are outside of the watershed. And it's not just the political power centers, but it's also the philanthropic power centers. Your William Penn foundations, your Heinz and Mellon foundations are not in the Bay watershed and are not active in the Bay watershed intentionally, very intentionally and deliberately. So these are not excuses. They're just sort of the realities of working in Pennsylvania. Having Chesapeake Bay in your title in Pennsylvania is not helpful. And the message has to be about water and local water quality. And also mentioned the number of local governments we have in Pennsylvania. That just translates into how people perceive what their local, what their community is, what their area of impact is. And it's not even about the Susquehanna. It's not even about the Juniata. It's about, Raccoon Creek, that's a tributary of the Juniata. It's about Little Buffalo Creek. It's about, Swatara Creek. It is down to that level. And we have 85,000 miles of streams and rivers in Pennsylvania. For our own Commonwealth assessment under the Clean Water Act, that 303D list, those are broken down into over 200,000 different segments. That is the area that we are talking about when people are thinking about what is my local water that I'm going to be interested and care about. So that's the scale that we're working at, and it's going to take segment by segment by segment by segment to affect major change in Pennsylvania. And that, by the way, is something that we are seeing happen. There is actively now, quote, delisting efforts in several counties in central Pennsylvania that are being helped and assisted by some new technology that's out there, including from the Chesapeake Conservancy and the greater Chesapeake community, the resources that are available, the monitoring, the modeling. Now these data resources coming to the table are really going to help with that effort. And that is the kind of assistance, bringing sort of this bigger Bay effort and momentum down to the local level for those local actors to make change. That is the change that we're starting to see, and we just need to build on that.
All right, thank you. To Ann and Allison, thank you again. This is probably the first time, and Morel, thank you so much for being here, because this is probably the first time that we've really kind of delved deeply into kind of Pennsylvania politics, the streams, and gotten a little bit more detail about the complexity. I know it's complex up there; it's just frustrating down here. But thank you for your continued work. And then the second part of my question, of course, is linked to the first part, right, Anne? Which is, and I'm sure my good friend Delegate Jacobs will probably follow up, but can you speak a little bit more on the dam and how or where funds may come from to actually deal with the dam? Like, where are we gonna, who do you think should be paying for this? How do we get the money? That kind of thing.
So-
I kind of see them all as connected to my first question.
Okay, so I'll try to answer a little bit of it, and I'm not trying to dodge it. It's very, first of all, this issue is confusing to me, so I don't mind saying to everyone here, this is a rough issue. First of all, Pennsylvania has about 30. It's about 35 million pounds left to go on its watershed implementation plan. Okay, so to give you a context, Maryland, what did I tell you earlier? Maryland has like 6 million pounds left to go. So scale is important. The Conowingo is above and beyond that. It's another 6 million. So the first thing I would ask you as legislators is, if you were going to invest money, your money in Pennsylvania, where would you invest first? Would you invest in the WIP that EPA has you on the hook for, and that CBF and the attorney generals are suing you over? Or would you invest in the Conowingo WIP? So I'm not telling you, I'm just asking. Okay,
I would say the former would make the most sense, right?
And I
Because if you-
wasn't even expecting you to answer.
right, but I mean, I think that
So-
right, and so this gets to a point that my chair was making earlier, and that is, you know, when someone is sick, like the Chesapeake Bay is sick, do we just treat the symptoms, or if there's a way to cure it, do we cure it? So it seems to me that money well spent would be like, let's figure out what the problem is and work it there and work it in both places. But to answer your question, I would say the former would make the most logical sense.
So here's what we know. We know that the loads coming over the Conowingo Dam, whether they're attributed to Pennsylvania or the Conowingo WIP, can be solved through agricultural practices. The other thing that we know is that the counties, there are 4 counties in the southern region that are delivering the lion's share of the load. And in Lancaster alone, Morel, what percentage of the total reductions just come from Lancaster?
21%.
Okay, so to me, it's like focus, just what you said. If there's a patient, let's focus. Let's focus on the worst symptoms first, okay? So it seems to me that anything that Maryland can do to help focus in Lancaster County and the adjacent York County, and you're going to be addressing the problems with your bathtub spigot, right? I mean, right? Because you don't, if the bay, your bay is the bathtub, you have a problem at the faucet, you know? So I would say anything you can do there is a wise investment. How can Maryland invest there? You know, how can Maryland help with data or additional people crunching numbers, or whatever it takes to get that section? Now, Morel mentioned a delisting thing, and the delisting is a really interesting approach, creek by creek, to delist. The chair of our commission, Senator Yaw, Republican from Pennsylvania, he says, start at the Maryland line and work up. Why don't you just start at the Maryland line and work up, you know? And it's an interesting approach. So the last piece I want to say, not to dodge your Conowingo question, is this. When the Conowingo WIP was first established as a separate load, it was thought that it would really engage the private sector, and that somehow there would be a finance strategy that would really pull in private finance. And I think there was a lot of hope that part of the FERC permits and the negotiations with Exelon would be financially fruitful, and they have not been. And so right now, that's why now in this finance strategy, and I have not seen it, I've only heard word that it's going to rely entirely on public funding. And I'm disappointed there, because I thought that perhaps we would see greater financial investments coming from Exelon. So I don't know if I answered your question, but and Morel, please, or Allison or Robin, if you have other things to say about the Conowingo WIP, please do.
Not necessarily about the Conowingo WIP, but in terms of how we're going to deal with those extra pounds, I think Maryland missed a big opportunity in the relicensing of the dam. I think the settlement agreement, and we're on record for this, the settlement agreement that the Hogan administration negotiated with Exelon and put forward to FERC, which they have not decided on yet, by the way. It is still out there. Is just a real shortfall. The reality is, yes, the pollution is coming from Pennsylvania, but if the dam wasn't there, the form and timing of that pollution reaching the Maryland downstream portion of the bay would be very different, and may not have the same level of impact that it has when we get the pulses that we now get. So they have a role to play. The ecology of the bay is different because they are a hydroelectric dam making safe energy, but they are making a profit off that water. And the form and timing of the pollution is different. So we think that there was more that needed to come from that settlement agreement and relicensing, and we will see what FERC has to say about it and make decisions with our partners around that. I mean, it's a 40-year license. Maryland set in stone what they're going to pay for the life of that dam being there, basically.
That's right.
And so, it's a one-time shot to bring another partner to the table in this. And again, we think it was a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
I think in terms of Pennsylvania, one thing that ties to the how are we going to deal with the dam and your earlier question, Delegate, is, and that I was remiss in not mentioning, is I think USDA has a significant role to play here. The amount of money needed in those 5 South Central counties, in all honesty, is couch change to USDA. It is nothing compared to their overall budget and their discretionary funding. And while we focus a lot on EPA, we need EPA to bring in the Department of Agriculture at the federal level, because they are the ones that have the level of resources needed and the discretionary spending of those resources needed to help, even if we just started in those 5 central counties with the smaller farmers that are there, because Pennsylvania is a whole lot of small farms, not a big few that we can go after, but a whole lot of little farms. If we could get them at the table, that would reduce the pounds going into local waters, into the Susquehanna, and ever reaching the dam.
I'm really glad
Allison.
that, I'm sorry.
Good. No, go ahead, Ann. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say, I'm really glad she brought that up. The Mississippi River actually has a program that's built inside of USDA. When we established the Chesapeake Watershed Initiative, it was through the Congress, and therefore in the next Farm Bill, it could be modified to be a nationwide program. But in the case of the Mississippi, when we were building the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Initiative through the Congress, the folks that were in charge of USDA were actually from the Midwest and the Mississippi River. So they built the Mississippi program inside. We've been in touch with the transition team and are now working on our transition document to go to them, which basically says, we want you to establish a Chesapeake Bay Watershed Initiative inside USDA, and we want you to focus on Pennsylvania. And you have to know that that's Marylanders and Virginians, supporting that. So, that's hard to do, but yet everybody on the commission is really focused Bay-wide, and they realize how important that is. And the Bay Foundation is a strong partner in that regard. So that's really important. The other thing is right now, we're working to grow the federal pot of money. First, we were successful in taking it from 73 million to 85, most of which went to Pennsylvania, or the biggest single part. And now we actually have an opportunity to grow it to 90.5. And while I don't know that it'll go all the way to 90.5, it will go likely higher than 85 million annually, and a piece of that will go to Pennsylvania.
So thank you very much, Allison. That was great. Like, this is the first I've heard of USDA funding, and I think that is a great opportunity because now it's not pitting Maryland against Virginia. I mean, against Pennsylvania or vice versa. It's like, okay, let's get together and go ask for money for both of our states, for Virginia as well, for New York, for all of them. I think that is a fabulous idea, and if I take anything. Which I do take a lot, but this in particular is a really enlightening piece. Thank you.
Just you start to look at their budgets and the light bulb kind of went off for me in the last year or so as we were looking at the budgets more and working with Chesapeake Bay Commission and others at the federal level. That's where the money is. EPA doesn't have a lot of money. USDA
right, and not only that, but it's not us going against each other. It's us going together, and that's much stronger. So, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Also want to say that it's good to hear that in Pennsylvania there is now a focus on local water quality. Even if the Bay is not as politically popular as it is here in Maryland, it's good to know that local water quality is being focused on, and that in turn will redound to the benefit of the Bay. Next question is Delegate Boyce.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here, and thank you all for this information. I do have a Conowingo Dam follow-up question, but I'll ask it after my question. Allison, you gave the scorecard, and what you said, and I think what I heard Ann say are pretty much the same, is that you're trying to get to 70% or 70, a score of 70. Can you tell me if that's the case, then what does the scores within the categories look like? In other words, is ag at 50 or is everyone else at 70 as well to kind of create a strong 70? Or will that be a mixing of an average to create a 70? So I'm just trying to understand what that looks like categorically, grade-wise, to get to that 70. And if 70 is the goal, yeah, again, if 70 is a goal, then categorically, what does that look like? Is 50 enough for urban and suburban? You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand that.
So they're actually two different things. So the State of the Bay scorecard that has the letter grades and the numbers, that was one of my slides, is broken up into a bunch of different indicators. They fall into categories of pollution and habitat and fisheries. So the different sectors all impact those scores, but they are not divided up based on urban, suburban, agriculture, wastewater treatment plant. The pollution ones, the top ones that are nitrogen, phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, water clarity, and toxics are linked the most to those sectors, I would say. And then the resulting habitat and fisheries kind of come from those pollution limits, but they're two different things. So we're looking to get a 70 on that scorecard. It's going to be a combination of improvements. Again, I think the more improvements we get from those first and the more improved grades we get from those first pollution indicators, we will see then the co-benefits related in habitat and fisheries. For the kind of red, yellow, green and how far we are getting to 2025, the bulk of the source comes from wastewater and agriculture. So that's where we need to see the most reductions. We're at where we need to be or on the right trajectory with wastewater. Agriculture has done a ton and we'll still need to do more. But where we're behind and need to make up the difference is that urban, suburban, and septics if we're going to see long-lasting improvements, because eventually the wastewater, the amount that we can get from wastewater is going to diminish. Eventually the amount that we can get from agriculture will also get harder. So for it to be lasting, we need to see those additional sectors step up. But they're kind of different in terms of the 70 grade is a different kind of report than the first sector report that I showed and that Ann kind of discussed similarly.
So I'm sorry, I'm a bit slow. So
Fine. No, you're not slow. I have to deal with
I
this
guess
every
the question
day.
for me is, I certainly understood all that. I guess what I'm saying is that, do those sectors have to be, all yellow to achieve that 70, or can one still be red and one then green and then, so I'm trying to figure out.
I think it could be a combination. I mean, for it to be lasting and to be equitable in our communities, and so that we don't have pollution hotspots, I think it needs to eventually come from all of them. But we could get there if we get to all of our pounds and it comes from wastewater and agriculture, we could still achieve that 70. It's just, will everybody throughout the watershed see that 70 or only some?
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, I'm sorry, Aunt. I guess I was just gonna say, because 70 seems low. I mean, 70 is borderline CD, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess I would think that it would be 80 or at least 75, because it then seems like there's more equitable efforts between each goal than saying 70, which means somebody is always, or something is always going to be off. So I'm just thinking.
Yeah. So I wasn't at Chesapeake Bay Foundation when we first started the scorecard and came up with that approach. I think it's because the 100 was the Captain John Smith days before there was any development in the watershed. And so when you go on that sliding scale, we can't ever go that far back. Scientifically, the 70 was felt to be enough where the system could take care of itself. So we would still maybe have a growing population, but the system could take place. I agree with you. It would be great to aim higher, because then one, we have a margin. We're not close to that line all the time, and we would see greater improvement in more places. But the 70 was kind of the main stem of the bay, functioning as an ecosystem should function. Not necessarily the best that it could be, but taking care of itself.
And, one of the things that's important to remember is that for the report cards, and the Bay Foundation does a report card, and so does the University of Maryland, and then the Chesapeake Bay Program puts out what's called a Bay Barometer, and each one grades a little differently, and they all try to include water quality and living resources and habitat to get the full picture. But also with the TMDL is a number. And in order to be measured against the TMDL achievement, that's just a number, which means you can get there any way you want. So it's similar to if both you and I went on a diet and I ate only ice cream, and you ate carrots and celery and, lean meat and whatever. And we both got there somehow, but, I had one ice cream cone every 3 days, which isn't healthy. And so, and you got there. So in the case of the TMDL, it's, as Allison said, it's really not healthy if you get to the TMDL in a very unbalanced way, because then you're ignoring local water quality problems or local other issues. But that's how it's measured. Now, the one thing you should know is every state has a watershed implementation plan. And in that plan, they've said how many acres of agricultural land will be treated, how many stormwater facilities, et cetera, in each sector. And so you can generate individual graphs that show progress in different sectors. Ultimately, they're not held accountable by the law. It's one number at the end. But you can see who's behind and not behind. And that data is really important to the Bay Foundation's analysis.
So in other words, 70 is the at least rate for which the system is clean and clear enough to kind of help itself, so long as those other factors remain constant and are improving. So it could go up so long as these things stay constant and start moving up. So as the ecosystem can take care of itself, the grade itself will move up itself, is what I'm hearing.
It should start to kind of have a positive feedback loop the higher up you get.
Okay.
See, you get it.
Yeah.
This is Morel. If I could just weigh in with one more point. And I don't know if CBF, as they were coming up with their goal, thought about that, but I know in our work engaging with stakeholders, it is really helpful to have a goal that feels achievable. So not having, an A perhaps as the goal, but having something that stakeholders feel is within reach, that they can manage, is helpful. So again, I don't know if that was behind CBF's decision, but that is important. And I think once we get to that point and start to see the positive feedback, that again will help build momentum for additional action.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that explanation. I'm just a visual learner, so it takes me a minute. So then my next question, very quickly and briefly, is regarding the Conowingo Dam. Okay, it was built 90 years ago. And have there been any considerations of the 90-year structure, and to the degree the add-on structure, as it relates to the ability, or unfortunately the inability, to manage this extra pollution pounds, right? And so, 90 years ago, things have changed dramatically from 90 years ago. Certain structures are built to last, and, I'm living in a house that's almost 100 years old, and so, but there are some nuances about my house that, in order to maybe bring it up to certain modernizations, I would have to totally deconstruct. And then there's some things that I can certainly create and create some adaptation. So I'm just wondering how the structure of the dam potentially prohibits, and this is not making an excuse, but this is just the way my mind thinks, prohibits the potential ability of the organization to, or the company to manage this issue.
I'm going to say that I probably need to connect you with MDE's dam safety side of the shop, because they look at the engineering of the dam a lot more. I imagine it would be very hard, because it's the Conowingo Dam system is actually multiple dams that go upstream. Conowingo is the last one in a series. And we have not explored or looked into whether there are engineering ways they could add a new structure or modify the structure. The pond behind it is full, and that's where the trapping capacity is gone. And I don't know if there's a structural way they could add to it. And why I said the dam safety is if that's feasible with something that is that age. So that is outside definitely the scope of what we have looked into at Chesapeake Bay Foundation.
So one of the things I can add is that the Army Corps of Engineers a number of years ago, but it wasn't a really long time ago, it might have been 5 years ago, they did an extremely comprehensive study where they looked at all kinds of options for managing the situation in terms of dynamic equilibrium. So they literally considered shunts around the dam and dredging and all kinds of different options. So they were looking into structural as well as non-structural options. And that study is out there. So that may be a source, but I never heard throughout that time of anything where anyone was considering some structural option to take care of the load.
Okay, Delegate Love, anything else? Are you good?
For me, or was that for Delegate Boyce?
Oh, I'm sorry, Delegate Boyce, I'm sorry. Delegate Boyce, any follow-up questions? No? Okay. Well, Delegate Love, you're on next.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Nice to see everyone today. Thank you, as always, for your presentations. my question is following up on something in Allison's presentation, but everybody is welcome to jump in. Allison, you spoke about the need to ensure that permitting accounts for climate change. Is MDE currently using updated climate figures when permitting? If not, when were MDE standards last updated?
MDE hinted in their Maryland watershed implementation plan that they were going to start to account for climate change in the permits. I don't think we have seen those changes in the permits yet. We don't see that there is a change standard for the level of storm that you have to control for. These permits are a number of years old. In terms of the supporting guidance documents, Robin, do you know the last time that they were updated? You're a little closer in the weeds to these than I am, but I think that the short answer is they could be doing a lot more in the drafts that we've seen compared to what we were expecting given the climate realities we're all aware of. But Robin, the last update?
I don't know the last update. I do know we plan to advocate in the 2021 session that they update the permits at least to account for increased rainfall on a 5-year basis at a minimum.
We can get you the guidance document, the last update, because again, it's like in the permits and then it usually references some construction standard or something else that's guidance outside of the permit. So Robin and I will follow up with the specifics, but again, short story is they're not there yet.
Thank you.
Okay, Delegate Love, any other questions or are you good? All right, Delegate Harrison.
Good morning, everyone. I hope that you all had a wonderful holiday and enjoying these last few weeks before we dive back into session. I wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for the presentations and thank you for letting us know that it was not all doom and gloom, that there is some light at the end of the tunnel and that we actually are making progress. That was very important because as I looked at some of the presentations last night, just scanning, and it didn't look too promising to me. So to hear that we actually are doing better is great. Allison, when you were talking about the urban suburban runoff and we were talking about tree plantings, my question revolves really around street trees and trying to deal with the heat islands. And one of the issues that I found in my previous position with street trees is that oftentimes, as they begin to grow and the roots grow, then they buckle and tear up the roadways and tear up the sidewalks, et cetera. So while we're trying to do something good on the one hand, we're actually causing another problem on the other side. Have you all ever made recommendations to the various jurisdictions on the types of trees that are better to avoid those types of problems so that we can achieve, all of the goals that we need to achieve without causing other problems?
I know that we always recommend to focus on the native trees, and I suspect our restoration specialist, if he was here, Rob Schnabel, would have more on which of the trees have better root systems for those urban plantings. I'm going to flag that because I think that's going to be an important part of the discussion for the Climate Solutions Act, because there is a focus on urban trees, partnering with the Chesapeake Bay Trust, because they implement a lot of these programs, to find out what discussions there are around the maintenance and picking the size or type of trees that maybe have more deep roots as opposed to a surface level root system that causes the problems that you identified. Because I personally am not sure which species are right for that, but that has to be part of the discussion. You're right, because if not, we're causing a hazard and more work down the road, no pun intended, if we don't pick the right trees to begin with. So thank you for flagging that.
And with that, so the deep roots versus the surface roots, then you have to worry about piping that's underground, because we still have that. So yeah, that's an issue and a concern of mine, especially as, you know, we're trying to get out and do a little bit more walking these days, and walking on the sidewalks, and it causes trip hazards.
Yep.
So thank you with that. And I think that's it. Anything else, I think I may just need to talk with you all offline just to get some clarification on some of the other issues that I won't take up time here.
Of course, please reach out and we'll try to share that information, what we find out about species more broadly.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Delgadado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate Ann and Allison for your presentations today. Allison, did I understand that you saw it on the chat, my question? Governor Cuomo and Governor Wolf are the ones that are lacking in the support for this?
I would say it goes back much further than the two that are currently in office.
That's a good answer.
No, I mean, it is. It's not a new problem, unfortunately, in these two states. And it is a combination of what they are able to do in the executive branch and the lack of partnership that they may get in the legislative branch. And then complicated by what Morel mentioned about just all the local jurisdictions that actually have the authority to do things in Pennsylvania. So a combination problem that goes back. So pick whoever you want to talk to in those states and talk to them about their need for improvement.
I think the state north of us, Pennsylvania, had a difficulty passing the budget a year or so ago. It took them about 18 months to get it straightened out. But
yeah, I think they may have just passed it this last week.
Okay. Thank you. And you had some mention in your position, and I thought you had retired, to be honest with you. I thought we had some celebration for you. Maybe it was just a recognition of your service, but you made some mention about an ag exemption in the latter part of your presentation. And
yeah, so what I was referring to is in the Clean Water Commerce Act, when it was negotiated 4 years ago, it exempted ag. So it did not address ag. And that was at the request of the ag community. You may recall when the bill first came in, it was a trading bill. And the General Assembly really did not want it to be a trading bill, but instead a procurement bill. When it was a trading bill, the agricultural community did not want that because they wanted credit for the reductions that they achieved. So if they did it, so now it was changed to a procurement bill, but by that time they had already, adopted their policy statements about whether they were supportive or not, and they did not want to be included. So now dial 4 years later, and now in the renegotiations, they see what's on their shoulders, and they want to step forward to take on responsibility. So they're good with expanding the Clean Water Commerce Act to include procurement provisions for agricultural projects. But we also included legislation that says, in the legislation language that we're working on, we said that the sector who achieves the reduction would be credited, not in the trading sense, but just in that it would go on their spreadsheet, like similar to what Delegate Boyce was asking earlier. So did that answer your question? That's
yeah, I'd like to know a little more about that. If you could forward me something of what you were referring to.
Sure.
Because I know what the actions we took in the 70s before 85 to reduce any contribution that agriculture made. And now we've not ever gotten any credit for that. And that is a big concern to me. And our biggest fault is because we're the largest land area. And and you just call us the largest contributor. And I think you did a nice job in your presentation of showing when we keep the turds from flowing out the pipe, we've done a good job and reduced the pollution. So,
So, you bring up I'm really glad you just said what you did, because it's really important for the committee to understand that, fully a quarter of the watershed is agricultural. So sometimes if you live in the more urban areas in Maryland, you forget how agricultural the watershed is. We have the largest non-irrigated land in the country. And so part of the agricultural load happens to just be a function of math. We have so many acres. Now, in terms of the credit to the agricultural community, one thing I will say is the number of best management practices that are creditable in the model is upwards of 200. When I first started, it was like in the 20, 30 practices. So the credit that is given to the agricultural community is enormous. And I don't want to underestimate I don't want to understate the load reductions they've achieved so far. They are extraordinary. But to do more, they need more technical assistance, they need more cost share, and they need it to happen both at the state and federal level.
thank you for those comments.
Right. So the Clean Water Commerce Act can help.
And the only other thing I have to add, Chairman Stein, much as I love you and Delegate Love, I would be interested to know how many miles of Chesapeake land or surface tidal areas that you represent. So for you
I'm
to
right
be
on the Potomac, Charles, so we can have that conversation.
Yeah. All right, fair enough, Delegate Otto. Next question, Delegate Jacobs.
All right, I think I'm on there now.
We hear you.
Okay. Well, every year we have the State of the Bay, and it always gets my blood flowing good. So, like the Bay. So I got a lot of notes, but interesting. And of course, that a lot of what I talk about is the Conowingo and the Conowingo effect, and I have been doing so since I've been in the General Assembly. I mean, there was kind of a big denial factor of it when I first got elected. And it's good to see everybody at least recognizes the fact that the reservoir is full and that really is trapping nothing. Fortunately for the Chesapeake Bay this year, all the storms really missed the upper part, and we didn't have a big flow coming through. The flow of water coming across the dam hasn't been as excessive this year as it could have been. And therefore, we've seen some positive results in the bay, especially with the growth of oysters, with the higher salinity count, and some better dead zones, or improved dead zones, I'll call it that way. Not that they're not still there, but we've seen some improvement there. But I guess it's disappointing to hear that there's very little, and Ann, you brought it up about the offsetting the nutrients passing across the Conowingo Dam. I mean, this is a real issue, that we're not trapping any sediment, we're not trapping any nutrients. 40% of the water coming into the bay comes across that dam. And we in Maryland, which has always been my gripe, we're downstream. We catch all of this. So we're ultimately responsible one way or another in meeting our goals of treating pollution that came from somewhere else, came from another state. And Pennsylvania, I mean, they're one of the 6 states. They're going to have to meet their requirements by EPA. So it's not something that we're going to have to make them do. They're going to have to do it, whether they represent Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Harrisburg or Lancaster County. They still, as a state, have to meet it. But my big question is, this $53 million a year estimate, and which is a very low estimate per year to meet to offset the nutrients passing through the dam, that's also with a huge agricultural element baked in. Isn't that correct? So that's a low number, and it's baked in with a high input of agricultural practices into that. I mean, some of the estimates are $368 million a year or higher. Isn't that correct?
No, so the difference there is that there are two watershed implementation plans. One is for Pennsylvania, and then of course there's New York's north of there. And then there's a separate one for the Conowingo 6 million pound additional load.
Correct.
So the $324 million number that you often hear, that's the gap in funding for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's total need is over 500 million, but the gap is 324. The other is the Conowingo, and they estimate that that load will cost about $53 million a year. That's almost entire, or I think it is entirely an agricultural load.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct. But that number is a low number. Some of the estimates were as high as 368 million to reduce those nutrients, from what I understand. I mean, that 53 was really on the low side, and it was really based on the agricultural issue. And I'm just trying to establish that is all. But
yeah, I don't know about the other number. I don't know about one of the others. I don't know about the other number.
Well,
I mean, neither number was generated by us. We did work on the 324 million pound gap. That was a part of the Pennsylvania whip, because our chairman at the time, Representative Everett and Morrell, chaired that committee. But we were not involved in the Conowingo estimates.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyhow, here, but these are real numbers, and the fact that everyone recognizes that the sediment, the reservoir is full. I'm glad to see everybody at least agrees with that. So we have a baseline. But what's going to come over that dam is going to be variable based on storms, which, according to your information, is going to increase. The storms are getting bigger, whether it be climate change, whatever factor you want to factor in. If they do get bigger, we're also dealing with an Exelon Maryland agreement over a 50-year period that does nothing to address the sediment. It's $500,000, I believe, in the whole agreement, in the settlement portion of it.
I think it's even less.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that's the biggest number of the whole agreement over 50 years is $500,000 to address the sediment, which we're all talking about the sediment being an issue, and the pollution that's going to come over that dam based on the fact that it's not trapping anymore. So it was kind of disturbing not to hear a lot of comments that, the disappointment in Maryland in trying to make this agreement and waive these water quality standards, that, here we are talking about how we're going to meet all these goals and what some of these problems are, but yet there's really not a whole lot being said about how bad that deal was with Maryland. But I mean, wouldn't you say that we'd be better off to get rid of the deal and do something different to address the the issue at hand than what's on the table?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that both Allison and I acknowledged that we had hoped that Exelon relicensing agreement would have been much stronger and had brought significant more capital to the table to address water quality related issues. It was very disappointing. Yes,
but as Marylanders, as all Marylanders, we're going to have to we are going to have to pay to play. We're going to have to be the ones to absorb what comes across that dam, which is not generated in Maryland. And, you know, what I think you said earlier, that all 6 states are going to have to participate in the cleanup. You know,
Well,
there's
that's,
a
Hold on, guys. Let me suggest that because the administration has tried to make this deal, until it's, you know, it's, dare I say it, it's water under the bridge at this point, unless the federal authorities fail to uphold the deal. So, I mean, I think the point that Ann and Jay have made are pretty valid, but I don't want the committee to spend too much time crying over spilled milk. That's the last metaphor I'm going to use.
Well, I don't want to cry over spilled milk, Mr. Chairman, but, you know, going forward, someone's going to have to be responsible for maintaining these total maximum daily loads. That's for sure. And
true enough.
And we're dealing with a reservoir that's full. And if FERC does come out and agree to the deal, you know, we as Marylanders downstream are going to have to pay to play, so to speak. So it's very concerning, and that's what my concern is that, you know, we're going to have to. They're sending me some good stuff on here about drinking almond milk and things.
Crying over spilled almond milk.
Right.
I'll just
trying to
quickly.
get serious. As I try to get serious, you know, it is a real issue, a real significant number for all Marylanders to have to absorb. And, you know, we have this TMDL, which is right around the corner. You know, 2025 is not far away, or 2030 is really not far away. And, you know, we need to get this thing right so that we're not bearing all the burden here in Maryland and absorbing all the nutrients because of a lack of trapping ability.
Delegate Jacobs, if I could interrupt, Delegate Jacobs, I just want to say, I think, you know, the concern is very valid, and you know, we're all, you know, clear that this is an important concern. Do you have any further questions, though, I should say, since we do have some more questioners to come?
No, I will refrain at this time, but reserve the right back to double dip later.
Duly noted. Okay.
Thanks, Chairman, if I may add,
sure.
Just real quick, you know, FERC hasn't approved it yet. There is nothing to stop, other than messy negotiations, from you all telling MDE to renegotiate. It is not a signed settlement agreement until FERC takes action. So if there is really outrage that is universal around the committee, you can voice that. Again, it's not final because FERC has not approved that water quality certification. It has gone on for a long period of time, and there could be efforts to redo that agreement. We have entered comments like that on the record, as have other partners. So it's not a done deal yet if people want to try to change what MDE agreed to.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think you have a question?
I do, as a matter of fact, and it has to do with the issue of urban runoff and smart growth. And the two would seem to be in conflict with one another. You know, here I'm sitting near Rockville Pike, and it's true that planting trees in Rockville is a good thing, but there is no tree planting on Rockville Pike that's going to stop the runoff from, you know, the runoff from that major thoroughfare. And so, you know, this is a basic tension I want you to comment on, the tension between the desire to engage in smart growth, which is good for the environment, especially with respect to global climate change, but at the same time, it promotes runoff, because there's no way to use tree planting or other mitigation techniques other than, you know, the the standard runoff mitigation techniques. Even if we do the best that we can do there's still going to be an increase in urban runoff. And I'm not going to suggest that we use the Chesapeake Bay as a argument to shut down smart growth in Rockville Pike and off of, in the biotechnology corridors of Gaithersburg, Rockville, Germantown, or the city of Frederick. So I wonder if you'd comment on that.
I think one opportunity is to look upstream of those areas. For example, Rockville's part of the Montgomery County MS4. The whole county is considered the MS4 jurisdiction. So the reductions that need to happen are countywide. So if you go upstream and try to either replant or do other best management practices, it slows what is coming through Rockville Pike and can ultimately lessen what then flows on the other side of Rockville. So those are some of the options. Offsetting within the same watershed where there is less developed areas is something that can be looked at. So I agree. We would like to see smart growth continue. The stormwater standards are usually less in smart growth areas than they are if you're developing a green field. And we have always been supportive of that. I think where we're seeing the problem again is the conversion of the open space. Less so than more development being added to an already developed area. It's that conversion of what was a natural filter where we're seeing that increase in load.
Okay, well, I'll just conclude by pointing out that there are companies like AstraZeneca and Emergent that are now very prominent in the news because they're going to be producing vaccines for COVID-19. And, in a lot of instances, I know that in the case of AstraZeneca MedImmune, their manufacturing facility, their research facilities in my district, but their manufacturing facilities is in Frederick. And as there's an increased expansion in those biotech fields, it's going to be impossible to restrain them from expanding. And so I only want to make that as a comment because we all need to know that all of these issues are interlinked.
Okay, all right, thank you. I actually have a question for Allison. Allison, in your presentation, you referred to a Venn diagram, those practices that sort of hit the sweet spot of addressing runoff, resiliency, and climate at the same time. You mentioned trees as a good example. Are there other practices, other BMPs that fit within that Venn diagram?
Well, also call on Robin if she has anything to add, though I think she just went off camera. So bioswales are another one. Anne mentioned any type of buffer, even if it is a grass buffer over a tree buffer, are very helpful. Living shorelines can be very helpful that way because they can help with the wave action, but also help trap some of the pollution compared to a hardened bulkhead. They're another option. We are seeing, and there's more science being done, interestingly, on oyster reefs, on whether or not, since they are, they filter, they can slow wave action so that as sea level rises or as the storms become more intense, there's less battering that happens to the shorelines. Robin, are there other practices that groups are, as you're working on the MS4 permits, identifying? I know it's more the natural practices as opposed to the engineered practices, but are there others beyond that I haven't mentioned?
I think what you've mentioned are certainly some of the top. Last year, the Bay Foundation worked on agriculture reform, and there we also see the importance of conversion from row crop practices to pasture and grazing. I just like to reference, what's been brought up as the focus on 2025 means that we've got to target the most cost-effective practices. And then also to reference what was raised by Delegate Boyce, there are all these different ways to achieve the WIPs. But why don't we then focus on the ways that bring us the best co-benefits? that bring a little bit more equity to our practices. In addition to improving water quality, they're improving climate, they're improving air quality, they're creating shade that mean that our buildings have to use less heating and air conditioning in the inner cities. So yeah, the focus is driven by cost effectiveness, permanence, which means cost effectiveness. You put a tree in the ground and it continues to deliver benefits for you with limited maintenance, right, over a 20-year period. And then those wonderful co-benefits. We talked about in PA. It's not just the bay, it's all the local streams that can really improve quality of life. They can improve economic value of residences. All these things coming together are the target right now.
Right, so I would just add that the other practice in there that you all worked on last year is really things that have to do with soil health. Because again, that soil health, if you're building the organic structure of the soil, it's not only retaining the water better, retaining the sediment particles better, but it's also sequestering carbon. And so you really do, you're creating essentially the forest equivalent, forest floor equivalent in agriculture of a sponge. The thing I would say relative to the wetlands that Allison mentioned, as well as the trees, is that you want a situation where you essentially are creating a sponge. The most powerful part of a tree is the forest that it grows in that forest, that forest floor is the place where the nutrients are being assimilated, the nutrients are being captured. And so anytime you can be promoting those permanent practices, whether it's a contiguous forest or a forest buffer, that is ideal. Same with a wetland, because a wetland is the aquatic equivalent. And then if you are going to have agricultural land, then you want those permanent practices like bioretention facilities or again, the agricultural buffers, things that matter and don't go from year to year. They're really for the life of the farm. So I think it is really important. It's one of the reasons in the Clean Water Commerce Act that we've been looking at your support for permanent practices and for landscape and forest restoration changes, because it really matters.
Just a quick follow-up question. Are most of these practices included in the state's phase 3 WIP plan to some degree or another?
I would say they're included, not to the degree that they need to be, considering all the co-benefits. We saw a decrease in the amount of forest and some of these natural filters in Maryland's plan compared to the previous version.
Okay, great.
And related to that, in terms of trees, almost all of the WIPs, perhaps not Pennsylvania's, Morel, you can correct me there if I'm wrong, saw there's been a real decline in the level of effort in terms of tree and tree establishment, buffer establishment. And so there's been a lot of discussion at the state and federal level about ways to sweeten that situation to better incentivize that. And it may have to do with technical assistance. It may have to do with programs like are being considered, whether it's paying for additional employees or additional cost share. But that practice is declining over time, and it's troubling.
Okay.
For
Thank you.
Pennsylvania's WIP, and since you brought it up, it's very difficult to compare the phase 2 and the phase 3 WIPs in Pennsylvania just because of the issues behind Pennsylvania's phase 2 WIP, which is a conversation for another day. But as far as phase 3 and where we stand now, of all the practices in the WIP, there are sort of 4 groups of practices that have been identified as the most cost effective and should be prioritized. Ag compliance, just bringing folks into compliance with our existing ag regulations, is one of them. But the other 3 all have to do with soil health and buffers. So it is very much highlighted in Pennsylvania's WIP as a priority. And in fact, one of the stakeholder work groups that helped to develop the WIP was devoted to forestry, and it is one of the major sections in the WIP, and that includes riparian forest buffers, and it's primarily driven by riparian forest buffers.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we'll turn to Delegate Terrasa.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on Chairman Barvey's question about smart growth and then our discussion about trees. You said, I don't remember who it was that was saying something about open space. Is there a certain amount of tree, I understand planting trees is important, but is there a certain amount of tree area within our smart growth areas that would is there a certain amount of, I guess, acreage or maybe less than acres within our smart growth areas that would make a difference, or open space within those areas that would make difference within the smart growth areas that might help with some of the runoff and with some of the other issues that we're discussing, so that you can have the benefits of smart growth, but also not all of the same issues with the lack of trees that come with that.
You know, many areas have set urban canopy goals for themselves and, you know, open space goals. I don't think there's a particular requirement in any of our smart growth laws that has like a hard and fast percentage or, you know, numerical amount that are required of the jurisdictions. But I think more and more jurisdictions are seeing the co-benefits and so taking it upon themselves. Robin, I don't think the MS4s, whether large or small, prescribe where the practices have to go in terms of urban, like redevelopment, smart growth areas compared to other parts of the jurisdiction.
No, I wasn't thinking of the MS4s, but the question did remind me of the work that we're doing locally now on forest conservation, because these questions come up and you can see them in a much finer detail. For example, how much tree cover must a developer leave when they're changing from a highly developed urban area versus how much tree cover is required by the forest conservation when they're developing a green field. Those sorts of decisions are dictated to a certain extent now by the local forest conservation ordinances and could be decided by a state level forest conservation law to a certain extent. But you see at that level of varying degrees of how much tree cover needs to be left on a lot when it's being developed or redeveloped.
Right, and that to that point, I guess my question is not what's required now, but what amount would be sufficient to create a benefit. I mean, is one tree enough? Is a concentration of 10 trees? Is an acre? Is a city block? What does that look like? I mean, I was in county government for 12 years and we struggled with that often. And I'm wondering what guidance either you can give or the state might be able to give to locals on that issue.
So you know, I'm reminded of a couple things. One is the Center for Watershed Protection did a study where they really looked at how much, when you had a forested watershed, when did you see significant impact, how much of that forest needed to be removed, where you began to see really, really serious impacts. And I believe that the number in the end was like 35%. And so that at least helped me visualize to understand, okay, at what point are you dealing with real loss? So then the question is, in many of our urban areas, we've already lost that. So then what do you do? And the one thing that I would say is that location matters. Location does matter, so that now we have modern technology that gives us information to 1 meter squared. And it's for the entire watershed. And it allows us to understand hydrology. And so, for example, if those trees are located in those areas where there's the greatest water, and we can get them at a density where they actually have a forest floor, where there's actually that duff layer, that would matter the most. So I think that's what you should strive for. And to my knowledge, there isn't something that says you need 8 trees or you need 12 trees. I think, but you have to try to get it kind of covered. The tree canopy goals are largely due to temperature. They're really for temperature as well, because the urban areas can be as much as 20 degrees warmer than other areas. I don't know if that helps.
It does. Maybe offline we could talk about what it takes to get a forest floor, because I'm not sure I understand that, but thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Delegate Holmes.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. Some of the presentation has been discussing, construction runoff and those kinds of issues. There's been a lot of revisions made recently, the past several decades or so. I recall when I first started designing subdivisions, you just put pipes end to end and you dumped everything into the Chesapeake Bay. Now at least we have the stormwater management ponds to assist in the slowing of the pollution and to have it settled up to the bottom. Has there been any discussions in terms of revising the calculations with, for example, the National Society of Professional Engineers, which is right there in Alexandria, Virginia, or someone to look at revising the calculations for stormwater runoff? As an example, most of the inlets you see in the streets, those inlets are designed for a 10-year storm. But the 10-year storm nowadays doesn't occur every 10 years. It occurs a whole lot more frequently. Stormwater management ponds are designed for 100-year storm events, which no longer occur at 100-year storm events. They occur more frequently. So the question is, has anyone that you know of been talking with the organizations that provide the design standards for those issues? I guess the silence means no.
Sorry, I was writing the question down because yes, you and I have definitely had the discussion about how things have changed. When you first started building subdivisions, it was like get it off the property as fast as possible, have it pass through nothing, and get to the nearest water body. I know that our scientist, I think many of you have met Doug Myers before. He is helping inform kind of what we're asking for in these permit revisions. And there's a team at CBF that is looking at technical guidance because we want to try to promote some consistency throughout the watershed around this issue. I will ask him specifically if he's had conversations or is pulling their recommendations as part of it, the different engineering and the, those site engineers. They've been very helpful when we had the smart growth discussions a number of years ago. On what's, there is a feasibility that has to come into play at some point, and how we go from where we are now to where we need to be. There may need to be some baby steps in between. So I will check with him and get back to you and the rest of the committee on who has been part of those discussions or what information is the environmental community relying on to inform those recommendations to NDE. And then I will just flag that if you have your annual briefing with the agencies, it would be great to ask NDE as well, because they did hint about this in their phase 3 watershed implementation plan, but we're not seeing it translate into the permits. So maybe, I don't know if they run into a technical gap or not, but I would be curious what information sources they're using too.
So
I appreciate, go ahead, I'm sorry.
We also, the Bay Commission staff was just provided a briefing from Villanova University. Villanova is working directly with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and they're really looking at what are the management practices that literally are used like adjacent to parking lots that now are better managing these increased storms. And they're seeing that with proper maintenance of these infiltration areas adjacent to the parking lots, that they actually can accommodate these much larger storms. So they're trying to develop a manual now about almost the maintenance of these facilities, because that maintenance ends up being critical. And Morel, I don't know if you want to add anything about that, but it seems to me that in any future guidance that has to be considered.
Yeah, I think it really came down to correct construction in the first place and proper maintenance and regular maintenance over time, that it wasn't so much the design that was the problem, it was the construction initially and the maintenance over time. Things like mulch, proper mulching of the site or improper mulching of the site was leading to failure of the system. Really simple potential fixes, but they do require time and effort to get the folks up to speed that need to be doing the work.
I appreciate that. And if you can get us any information at all in terms of how that process is going, we would appreciate it, because like everyone knows, our committee, we love stoichiometry. So thank you so much.
I was wondering when that was going to be mentioned.
Thank you, Delegate. Yeah, it's been, gosh, since I guess it's been several months since I've heard stoichiometry, so it's always nice to hear that.
Or King Charles I.
What's that?
Or King Charles I.
Yes, yes. So the last question goes to Delegate Love. I know that she had asked a question about stormwater standards, and Allison had posted a reply in the chat box, but I figured for everyone who's listening to hear, maybe Delegate Love, if you wanted to follow up with Allison.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I think you actually just prompted exactly what I was going to say. Allison, did you want to amend your response?
Sure. So there are people out listening on the web. It's not just all of us talking to ourselves, because someone quickly got to me the answer about the last time the standards were updated. It was in 2010 that the stormwater standards that include information about rainfall were updated. But at that time, the precipitation information that was used to inform that was about 5 or 6 years old. So if you add that it was last done in 2010 and relying on information that was 5 or 6 years old at the time, we're about 15 or 16 years outdated on our standards compared to current rainfall patterns. So thank you, environmental partners out there listening, who very quickly provided the answer. And I didn't realize that while it makes sense, while I put the answer in the chat, that those that are listening in and not part of the chat wouldn't have benefited from that information. So thank you for asking it again.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Mr. Chairman, that's a wrap. So,
okay,
and things back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairman. You did a terrific job here. Let me just say, of course, Allison and Ann, you did a terrific job. And I guess, Allison, is this the last time you're going to be presenting to us in this capacity? That's so sad. But
yeah, potentially this is it. I'm sure there'll be some hearings that I'll participate in or serve as backup. But yes, I'm hopeful in the next few weeks that there'll be a new Maryland executive director, and all your questions on Pennsylvania will become a lot more real in my new role, since I'll need to oversee the activities throughout the watershed now, not just Maryland. So I had to pay close attention to those.
Well, that's great, and we do always look forward to seeing you. I have to say, Allison, I think it was you made my week and maybe my month and year when you mentioned the USDA and the fact that this kind of a program is, quote, couch change, a cushion change.
Yeah.
I mean, and I have to say, I've been chair of this committee now for, I've been chairman for 6 years now. And of course, I don't know, what works and what doesn't work at the federal level. And the very notion of working with our colleagues in Pennsylvania and Virginia to advocate for going after this money in four large counties or boroughs or whatever they call them, Lancaster, I think is what you mentioned. And that's something I very much look forward to, because it would be great to have the US senators from 3 states and even rural conservative members of Congress from those 3 states, regardless of party. It would be great to have them work together before the federal government during the next administration, because that would be a fantastic, because this is a new thing that I've heard proposed to us as a committee, and I think it's a terrific new avenue for pursuit, and I know you can count on us to be extremely supportive of that. And so, without any further ado, I want to thank everybody for the terrific questions. I think we had a really fantastic conversation here. I mean, I think we had an opportunity, all of us, to really discuss in depth what's really happening. And in many ways, this is probably one of the best conversations on this topic that I've seen in my tenure as chairman of the committee. And so thank you to everybody. And of course, as I've said on all of these Zoom meetings, this is not the end of the conversation, it's continuation of the conversation. So I want to thank everybody, and you're all free to go now. Take care.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.